Hey guys, Danny Johnson here. Today we're going to be putting a new clutch, throwout bearing, and retainer sleeve on this 2004 SVT Cobra. So you're going to want to take your pilot bearing, put it in the freezer, and that'll help for later on. Start by removing both the negative and positive side of the battery. We will be working near the starter, and even with the car off, it can shock you really bad. For most factory batteries, it's going to be an 8mm socket. However, if your car has had a new cable ends put on before, it may be a different size, and that's pretty common. Next, you're going to want to lift the car, and you're going to want to put the jack here towards the back, and then place a jack stand on these torque boxes in the rear. So you do that on one side, then come over and do it as we have on this other side. And the reason for this is we want to be able to spin the wheel, which in turn is going to be spinning our drive shaft. So we can loosen up each of those bolts and just turn the drive shaft to expose the next bolt. Next, you want to find a 12-point 12mm socket, and we're going to disconnect those drive shaft bolts. So you want to turn the drive shaft so the first bolt is exposed, and then pull the handbrake up to lock the wheels. Next, come in the car and put the handbrake back down. That'll allow you to spin the wheels, thus turning the drive shaft. So spin the drive shaft to expose the next bolt. Then pull the handbrake back up and break the next bolt loose. You're going to continue that process until all 4 bolts have been removed. So when you're removing the drive shaft bolts, you can leave 1 or 2 of them in for now, because otherwise when you're taking this off, it's going to be hanging on your mid pipe until you can get the mid pipe out of the way. So it's okay just to leave a bolt or 2 in and leave it attached for now. As for the rest of the bolts from the drive shaft and throughout the project, you can take Ziploc bags and label them and put them inside, and that will help you keep everything separated. Next, lift the car up and remove the jack stands, and we're going to be moving to the front of the car. Now we're going to lift the car into the air on the front. So we came in with our jack here towards the back and lifted up so that we had room to place our jack stand. You want to make sure that it's cradling this beam perfectly, and you do want it up pretty high and pretty far forward on that beam. Now we're going to go around to the other side and put another jack stand in that same place. So as you're lifting the other side of the car, pay very special close attention to the jack on this side and make sure that it's still secure and not being tipped over. On each side of the car, the exhaust goes up to the exhaust manifolds, and you have 2 15mm bolts. So we're accessing these using a long extension and a 15mm socket. So there's 2 of them on each side, and I highly recommend shooting some liquid wrench on these bolts first and letting them soak for a minute. It really helps out. So you got 2 on each side that we'll be going after. To make it easier, instead of unscrewing these O2 sensors, you can simply just unplug them. So you push down on the tab and then pull them apart. And sometimes it helps to put a screwdriver between it and pry it if you need to. So you want to do that to the O2 sensors on both sides here. Okay, we're going to go ahead and remove the dust shield here. And so it's just a 3/8 inch socket, 1 little bolt here on the back, and by removing this we'll have better access to our O2 sensor, which are up here. We're going to use a 7/8 inch wrench to break it loose and unscrew it, since it's pretty hard to reach that connector at the top. So we went ahead and broke this O2 sensor loose with a 7/8 inch wrench, And now we're just spinning it to unscrew it. If you're careful not to bind the wires too much, you can just unscrew it and it will come out. Okay, so there it is, hanging there now. We'll just do the same thing on the other side. Okay, go ahead and break the passenger side O2 sensor loose up on the front. Once you get it loose, you can unspin that one by hand. So next, to get the exhaust nuts on the passenger side, we're using a long extension with a swivel in order to get the right angle, and then a deep socket to go over the stud. I have been able to switch to a 1/2-inch drive socket, which acts somewhat like a deep socket to get over the stud, but is better clearance for where it's rounded right there. But anyway, looks like that worked just fine, so we're going to take off the other nut that's on the bottom side of that. So next is we're unbolting the mid pipe to the catback. You want to put some nice rags over your exhaust tips, because as we disconnect this, the exhaust can move around and you don't want to mark up your bumper. Next, we're unbolting the exhaust where the mid pipe meets the catback. So you're going to take a 15mm socket to undo these nuts, and if it's factory, the stud should stay in place. If not, you'll have to put a socket on one side and then come around to the other side with another socket, but it has these nice tabs from the factory that will spin and hit the exhaust and keep everything from moving. Now it's best just to get underneath the car, and you're going to be shaking the exhaust loose and disconnecting it from the back here. Put your foot on a muffler if you need to kind of separate everything. But it might take some shaking, but you're just going to basically drop it straight down. So now you'll just drop this down out of the way. You might have to shake it around, and then you can just work your way back and slide yourself out from underneath the car with it. Next, we're removing the starter, which is connected to the front of the transmission here, and it has 3 bolts. There's one here, there's one here, and then there's one that's somewhat out of sight, and as you see, we have our wrench on it. It's just up a little bit higher. And that one everyone always complains about getting out, but as you can see, if the exhaust has been removed, you have a little bit more clearance. If you're using a 1/4-inch drive, you should be able to get on it and remove that 3rd bolt with no problems. And we're just taking these 3 13mm bolts out. Okay, so with all 3 bolts removed, you can now slide the starter away and simply just set it down, resting on the K-member here. Just make sure it doesn't fall and hit you in the head. Next, we're taking our 15mm socket and removing this front crossmember bar. It also has the locking tabs here on the front, so you should be able just to loosen it, and those tabs will hit against the frame, and just be able to take it off that way. Next, we're going to drain the transmission fluid, so we have our pan in place. And right here on the side of the transmission where it says drain, there's a drain plug that we're going to remove. And we're just going to let all the transmission fluid drain out into the pan. So for this, you're just using the head of the 3/8-inch drive. And so just remove that drain plug. And it's going to shoot out towards you, and then as it slows down, the flow is going to walk its way back that way, so you want to follow it with the pan. Okay, when it's pretty well drained out, go ahead and put the drain plug back in. It screws right back in. You want to get this drain plug snug, but you don't want to force it on too much. It can force its way into the transmission and it'll just keep going, so just get it nice and snug. Wherever possible, I like to put the nuts back onto studs so that you don't lose them, and it's easier to keep track of where everything goes that way. Now we're going to finish removing the drive shaft, so you want to come in with a marker and just mark up the relationship from the flange to the actual drive shaft. Also, to get the drive shaft separated, sometimes you have to get a screwdriver and just put it in right about there and pound it to separate it, because it can be pretty tight. So go ahead and pull the drive shaft away. So with the drive shaft removed from the back, you can now pull the drive shaft straight out from the transmission. And you still might lose a little bit of fluid there, so we've put down some cardboard, and you can put your catch pan under there if you'd like. Now we're going to remove the shifter. So you're going to go ahead and unscrew the shift knob by turning it counterclockwise. Next, you're going to slightly pull that boot over the top of that jam nut if you have one there. And you want to reach in and pull this lower bezel straight out. You want to be careful with these plastic clips on these. So if you can just get your fingers in behind it and pull straight out towards you, then it will start to come out. Then you want to disconnect the cigarette lighter. Next, we're using an 8mm socket in order to take off these 4 bolts that are going around the bezel. You want to be careful not to whack up your interior as you're taking these out. With those 4 bolts out of the way, you can remove this bezel. Normally the rubber boot's still connected to it. We've just modified it to go around this short throw shifter. Okay, so we're removing the 4 13mm bolts that are holding the shifter to the transmission. To separate the shifter, you can come from underneath the transmission, as we're doing here with a nice flat edge pry bar, and hit on the bottom of it with a hammer, and that should loosen everything up. Now you can lift the shifter off. So on the Cobra T56 there is another connection up here, and so you just put a screwdriver under that white tab right there to lift up and slide that connector off. So just lift on that tab with this screwdriver, then just slide the connector away. Back underneath the car, we're going to disconnect the clutch cable. So you want to take a screwdriver and pry off that C-clip that was holding that in place. Next, you're going to take a breaker bar or a pry bar. You're going to put it up in the transmission and push that clutch fork forward enough to unloop the clutch cable. So normally you can push this forward and then simply put the cable up through that bigger hole here, but this is an aftermarket cable, so we're going to take this nut off the back. So on this specific clutch cable, you have to use a 13mm wrench to hold one part of it still while taking off the 13mm nut with another wrench. Next, pull the cable through the transmission. Next, you want to come in and remove these harnesses by pushing straight up with a screwdriver, and it's kind of a Christmas tree type pin. You could also take a hammer and just kind of pound them out here if you want. Yeah, that one's out. Got that one out there. Next, you'll remove this connector here on the back, and so you just lift on each of those tabs. Just lift up on them at the same time, and it'll slide off. There. On the passenger side, there's another connector that you'll lift the tab and separate. You'll also have to pull this O2 sensor straight out of its bracket. So now we've brought our floor jack in just to support the transmission, and we're going to go ahead and take out these 13mm bolts on each side for the transmission cross mount. With these bolts removed for the transmission cross mount, we can now lower the transmission, and it's going to help us access the bolts in the front a little bit better. Next, we're going to be taking out the transmission bolts. Now, on the Cobra T56, you can leave the bell housing on and take out the bolts right here to separate it and take only this section off. If you're doing this on a regular Mustang, I do have another video on that. But basically you just have to go through and find all the transmission bolts that are going up and around, and there's some that are very high up in the very top of the transmission that you'll need some extensions and swivels to get to. As far as the Cobra, we're just going to be taking these ones out for now. And there is a bolt at the top, which is referred to as the B bolt because it's really hard to get off. And it has a vent tube going through there from the transmission, and that vent tube has a bracket on it, and it's bolted up to one of these top bolts. So that's why it's kind of hard to get in behind this vent tube and onto that bolt. But as we've dropped the rear of the transmission down, we have a little more room to get there. So now we're removing these 15mm bolts. And we're starting with the B bolt at the very top, and so we're going around that vent tube. You can see this by using a very long extension, and that extension is running the whole length of the transmission, and then back here is where we can actually break it loose with a breaker bar. So you're going to want to take off the top transmission bolts in that way, and then move down and remove these other ones. So just make sure that you have your transmission jack or floor jack supporting the back of it here. Okay, so we've gone in and removed most of the transmission bolts, the top ones and the bottom ones. We've left the side ones in for now. Those are the last ones that we'll be taking out. We also do have a transmission jack here. So we moved the floor jack out and moved this one in. It's just going to cradle the transmission a little bit better. If you don't have one of these, you can use a floor jack, and my other video shows how to do that, but basically you just want to support it. And now we'll go after those last few bolts. Once those are out, we're just going to take the whole transmission and move it away from the car, and as soon as that input shaft from the transmission comes out of the pilot bearing, out of the clutch, and clears everything, then we can drop the transmission down. If you do have a transmission jack, you'll run this chain up over the top and secure it that way. But the transmission doesn't have any more bolts in it now, so we'll pull it straight back away and then lower it down. So now you can slide the transmission out from underneath the car, and that bearing is toast. Next we're going to remove the clutch fork. So you want to push it down right here, and it will just pop off if you pull straight down on it. There we go. Now you can slide the throwout bearing with the clutch fork still attached off. Might be a little bit stubborn since this is definitely a bad bearing.